Sometimes a video game gets released at the absolute perfect time. It just so happens to line up with an era in gaming history that values every element said game is hoping to provide. Or maybe it gets lucky and releases alongside totally unrelated but beneficial real-world events, propelling it to new levels of success no one could have ever predicted. But other times, the exact opposite happens. A game comes along in the worst possible moment, leaving it tossed to the side, wondering where it all went wrong. And I'm not sure if there are many games that encapsulate this phenomenon better than Lawbreakers from Bleszinski and Boss Key Productions. Launched in 2017, this hero shooter had all the makings of a dominant new entry in the multiplayer space, and yet it was taken offline just 1 year later. So let's find out how a game in a market-leading genre, coming from one of the most popular game creators of his generation, could end up failing this catastrophically. This is the story of Lawbreakers, and this is the story of how not to save a game. In 2006, a little game you may have heard of called Gears of War was released on the Xbox 360. Its iconic cast of characters, fun multiplayer modes, and over-the-top violence made it an immediate hit with gamers. Gears would quickly become one of Xbox's marquee franchises, rounding out their big three alongside Halo and Forza. As the series continued receiving new installments throughout the 360 era, one particular member of the Epic Games dev team began to stand out. I am of course referring to Cliff Bleszinski, lead designer of the original Gears of War trilogy. As the forward-facing figure of the IP, Cliff would frequently do interviews and show up at press events on behalf of the team. And at this point, it started to become clear where exactly the boisterous nature of the Gears franchise was coming from, as good old Cliffy B was not particularly shy. Nowadays, Cliff's reputation is not so peachy, as we'll get into later, but I think it's important to note that back in this era, he was fairly well liked. However, his boldness and cocky attitude also made him a frequent target for hate, and he definitely attracted some of that onto himself, often getting into public arguments with fans on social media. So while he wasn't everyone's favorite, there were a lot of people who did like that rashness. And it certainly didn't hurt that he was helping to make some damn good video games. The success of Gears also coincided with the early social media days where game creators could garner more personal followings of their own that were not necessarily tied to the company they worked for. All of these factors were the perfect opportunity for Bleszinski to take the gaming world by storm. PC Gamer called him one of the next game gods. By 2009, IGN crowned him as a top 40 game creator of all time. He was getting mainstream media coverage with full-on features from publications like The New Yorker, and he even made an appearance on Late Night with Jimmy Fallon to promote Gears of War 3. Cliff had become a full-on gaming celebrity, with a rapidly growing dedicated following and one of the most popular modern gaming IPs to his name. But even with all of those incredible achievements, his story was really only just getting started. In 2012, shortly after the release of Gears of War 3, Cliff made the shocking announcement that he would be leaving Epic Games, ending his 20-year stint with the company. Publicly, he said he just needed a break after feverishly making games non-stop since he was a teenager, but privately, he considered it a retirement, having grown jaded by the current gaming landscape. However, as is often the case with creatives, he just couldn't seem to stay away. And so in 2014, Cliff announced on Twitter that he was making his return to games, alongside the reveal of his brand new studio titled Boss Key Productions. Their first game would be a new multiplayer game, codenamed Blue Streak. Initial info was light, but there were a few key details given. It was going to be a sci-fi arena shooter and would be published by Nexon, a major South Korean gaming company. Perhaps most interestingly, it was said to be a free-to-play game, which back in 2014 was still a relatively new concept. Despite not knowing much of anything about the project, fans were understandably excited. After all, this was the guy who had led Gears of War, so the words new multiplayer shooter was pretty much all we needed to hear. A more concrete reveal would come a year later, alongside an official name, Lawbreakers. Lawbreakers would be a 5v5 competitive game set in the future where criminals from around the world have ganged together to cause chaos, forcing law enforcement agencies to do the same. The combat between these two groups would be the basis for Lawbreakers' lore and gameplay. Speaking of gameplay, we also got our first look at the game itself around this same time. And again, it looked fairly promising promising. It had cool movement abilities like grappling hooks and anti-gravity jumps, alongside fast-paced combat that reminded Cliff fans of his days working on Unreal Tournament. This first gameplay trailer showed off another key element of Lawbreakers: hero abilities, a concept that tends to get eyes rolling today, but was all the rage back in the 2010s. Characters would have jetpacks, laser weapons, ground slams, rocket jumps, and more, as Lawbreakers looked to combine visceral arena shooter combat with trendy hero shooter specialties. It seemed like a decent idea, taking inspiration from both classic games that Cliff's fans would respond well to, while also incorporating modern-day selling points. However, this inclusion of hero shooter abilities would end up being one of Lawbreakers' biggest hurdles. Back in 2014, while Lawbreakers was in development and preparing for its first public appearance, a different gaming company had a multiplayer game ready to unveil. This game, announced in November 2014, was Overwatch from Blizzard. As their first new IP in quite a long time, Overwatch was a huge deal, and the hype was immense. It felt like everyone was talking about Blizzard's new game and could not wait for it to release. The reason this is relevant to our story today is that, as most of you probably already know, Overwatch was also a hero shooter. Featuring similar movement abilities and gameplay concepts, members of Boss Key were immediately concerned, with Bleszinski recalling an artist on the team bluntly saying, "We are so Blizzard had beaten them to the punch." And once Lawbreakers was unveiled, the comparisons were going to be unavoidable. Their reveal trailers were bombarded with mentions of Blizzard's game, and once Overwatch did release in May of 2016, this problem only got worse. It was an immediate smash hit, becoming one of the most played games in the world. It was highly praised by players and critics alike, even winning Game of the Year awards. I know for some of you out there, it may be hard to envision a time when Overwatch was this beloved. In its later years, and certainly into the Overwatch 2 era, it's become a punching bag. But back then, it was a totally different story. Anyone who was there at the time knows how popular this game was, and how much players genuinely enjoyed it. This positive launch was only going to make Lawbreakers' job even harder. They would now not only have to convince gamers their game was different from Overwatch, but they would also need to persuade them to stop playing the game everyone loves and try theirs instead. In other words, they would now have to go head to head with one of gaming's most powerful companies and one of the industry's most successful new games. With Overwatch seemingly continuing to get more popular with each passing day, this was going to be a serious challenge. And let's be honest, Boss Key did not have the money or the workforce or the prominence of Blizzard. But for all of Boss Key's shortcomings in this regard, they did still have one thing going for them: a founding member who had shown an ability to connect with gamers and make games they responded well to. And so, for better or for worse, it was Cliffy B time. Throughout 2016, Lawbreakers marketing really started heating up, with appearances at gaming showcases, tons of new trailers, and various alpha tests. But it seemed the only thing on anyone's mind was Overwatch. The team couldn't get through one interview or one public appearance without getting asked about Blizzard's game. It was at this point that Lawbreakers reached a crossroads. They could try to ignore the noise and focus on what makes their game great, or they could go at the competition head on. And if we've learned anything about the team's leading man, it should be no surprise what path they took. Cliff never shied away from the comparison, and although he typically kept a cordial tone about Overwatch, that didn't stop some of his comments from ruffling feathers. The most infamous moment came when Cliff described Overwatch as a game meant for a younger crowd.
But I think one of the main things that's going to make us stand out is our tone. The fact that we're kind of a mature rated game, or kind of more of an adult one. Our world is less saturated. It's not fully day-glow like a lot of those characters. And a lot of those games, as great as they look like they're for a younger crowd, filmed with whimsical characters instead of, ones that I find aspirational that are a little bit more Quentin Tarantino.
Now, if we're being honest here, I don't think anything that Cliff said is wrong. Overwatch's more colorful cast of characters absolutely allowed it to garner a younger audience, and that was certainly by design. But a lot of people interpreted this as a shot, acting as if Cliff had called Overwatch a game that's just for children. The quote, "Overwatch is for a younger crowd," was spread all over the place without the full context of what was said. And yeah, when you see that quote on its own, I can see how people read it as an insult, but it never was. It was just the truth. Overwatch was catering to a younger audience, while Lawbreakers was targeting the older gamers. Neither of those options is inherently better or worse, but this quote took on a total life of its own, and in a lot of ways, fueled the rivalry. I have to imagine this was an incredibly frustrating time for the Boss Key team. They were being asked about Overwatch at every turn, and then getting backlash that they had just compared their game to Overwatch. And this is precisely what I mentioned in the intro about a game releasing at the wrong time. Lawbreakers was coming in hot during the honeymoon phase of Overwatch, when they could do no wrong. Lawbreakers was seen as the desperate attempt to cash in, with Cliffy B as the grumpy old man saying new games are too kiddie, instead of his old persona of the cool, edgy guy making Gears of War. So no matter what they said or did, it kind of felt like people had already made up their minds. However, that's not to say Bosky and Cliff were completely blameless in this whole thing, because they made a lot of mistakes as well. A major moment for Lawbreakers came in March 2016, with the team announcing they were moving away from the free-to-play business model. Lawbreakers would instead be a paid experience, however they promised it would not be fully priced at $60. The reason for this was simple. The team was struggling to find ways to monetize a free-to-play product without hurting the competitive nature of the game with pay-to-win mechanics. This is another example of Lawbreakers releasing at the worst possible time, because back then, microtransactions in games always seemed to be loot box gambling or pay-to-win BS, as opposed to what we see today with battle passes and cosmetics that typically don't directly affect gameplay. Gamers have made it pretty clear what they do and don't want, and most games have agreed to play by those rules. Other than sports games, I guess, they still get away with it somehow. But Lawbreakers came at a time before these traditions were in place, when it wasn't clear how to monetize your game without blatantly screwing over your players. This timing is a shame because Lawbreakers could have benefited so much from being free to play. There would have been such a higher incentive to give the game a shot if it was free, instead of most people thinking, I just bought Overwatch, I don't think I want to buy another multiplayer shooter right now. It also would have allowed Lawbreakers to be at the forefront of the free-to-play revolution. They ended up releasing right around the rise of Fortnite Battle Royale, which was what really pushed the free-to-play model and cosmetic-based monetization systems that dominate the industry today. If Lawbreakers had come a year or two later, or even just a couple months later, they could have easily copied Fortnite's model like everyone else did and maybe potentially find success. But again, wrong place, wrong time, and they would now be moving forward as a premium game. Another change to release plans came at E3 2017, a few months before Lawbreakers was set to release. Throughout its entire development, Lawbreakers was always marketed as a PC-only game, but Boss Key announced it would now also be coming to PlayStation 4. As for the Xbox One, well, that version would have to wait. This caused an uproar, as many of Cliff's diehard fans from the Gears of War days were Xbox players. They felt betrayed by the fact that the game wouldn't come to Xbox, and fanboyism aside, I do think there is a legitimate argument to be made here that this was a big mistake. Boss Key's reasoning for it was very understandable, saying as a small team they could only really afford one console version, and so they chose the more popular console. A very logical decision, but one that may have missed the mark. Because while the Xbox One was certainly less popular, having a game made by Cliff Bleszinski meant something to that audience in a way that it didn't to the PlayStation crowd. It kind of reminds me of Sunset Overdrive, where Xbox signed a deal with Insomniac and thought it was going to be this huge thing, but no one really cared. PlayStation fans knew Insomniac and loved them for games like Ratchet & Clank or Resistance, but what did an Xbox fan know them for? Fuse? Their logo didn't mean anything to that player base, just like how the name Cliffy B didn't mean anything to the average PlayStation fan. I don't think having Lawbreakers on Xbox One would have totally changed everything about the fate of the game, but it definitely could not have hurt. In fact, a few years later, Bleszinski admitted it was a mistake to skip the platform, as it didn't allow those dedicated Gears fans to support Lawbreakers in a time when they needed all the help they could get. Regardless, there was no time to right this wrong, as the launch date for Lawbreakers was approaching quickly, and in my eyes, it could not come fast enough. All this Overwatch talk and Xbox controversies and Cliff Bleszinski discourse was only harming Lawbreakers. Their best bet was to just get the game in the hands of players and let it speak for itself. So on August 8th, 2017, they did just that, with Lawbreakers finally releasing to the public. Well, after all that mayhem, it's finally time to actually discuss the game itself. itself, which I kinda figure is the same kind of relief the Boss Key team felt as well. Lawbreakers received decent scores from critics, landing at a 76 on Metacritic. Nothing crazy, but certainly not horrible either. It seemed as though Lawbreakers had gotten quite a bit right, albeit not without its faults. I would agree with that assessment, as yes, I was one of the few people who did indeed buy and play this game when it came out. And I gotta say, I kinda liked it. It had a lot of what I personally enjoy in a multiplayer game. Fun abilities, intricate movement that is easy to pick up but hard to master, and tons of fast-paced action. The anti-gravity stuff was cool too, and was a unique element you didn't see in many other games. The biggest detractor for me, however, was that the game just felt kind of bland. The map designs were a bit lifeless, almost to the point where you could place the exact same map in any other game and it could realistically fit. It was just like multiplayer arena shooter map number 1 and multiplayer arena shooter map number 2. Character designs felt equally boring. They were pretty much all just generic looking people in body armor. This was on purpose as part of Boss Key's previously mentioned goal of making the game more grounded and gritty than their competitors, but I also think that decision made it pretty clear why the competition went in the other direction. Lawbreakers had cool abilities, but no one cool to show them off. While Blizzard was printing money making Tracer merchandise, even Lawbreakers' biggest fans were struggling to remember a single character's name. It wasn't some coincidence the games featuring a cartoony art style were finding more success. Going against that grain for no real reason other than we need to look different than Overwatch probably wasn't the greatest idea. Speaking of Overwatch, once I actually got my hands on Lawbreakers, that entire rivalry became all the more strange. Anyone who tried them both knows Lawbreakers played nothing like Overwatch. You can probably put that together just from the footage you've been seeing throughout this video. Lawbreakers was an arena shooter, much closer to a Quake or Unreal Tournament, whereas Overwatch was going for the objective-based team play of a Team Fortress 2. Lawbreakers was infinitely faster paced than Overwatch and had entirely different game modes as well. I mean, pretty much the literal only similarity was that they had hero abilities. And giving Lawbreakers flack for that is kind of ironic considering Overwatch did not even invent that in the first place. But as I've been saying, it was just awful timing. Overwatch was on fire, and tons of other hero shooters we haven't even mentioned yet were hitting the market all at once, such as Battleborn, causing the genre to feel very overwhelming and tiresome. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Lawbreakers struggled to find its audience. It had a very weak launch on Steam with a 60% drop in players from what it had achieved during its open beta. Bleszinski claimed the game was doing better on PS4, but with no public numbers to back that up, it's hard to say what exactly that meant. This slow start caused an interesting phenomenon, one that is now quite common today, with it becoming a huge news story. Sites were reporting on how bad the game was doing, gamers were stalking Steam charts to see what the player count was, and many seem to be legitimately happy at the poor outcome. Nowadays, we see this reaction to just about every game that comes out, but back then, it was a lot rarer to see. Obviously, games always got hate or had people that didn't want to play them, but the celebratory nature of watching player numbers fall is a much more modern trend. Lawbreakers may have genuinely been the first major example of this, where more people were interested in how it was performing than anything to do with the game itself. And as I look back through the whole story, I'm not really sure why exactly that was. Cliff Bleszinski is a polarizing figure who's made some enemies over the years, so certainly there were a lot of people who just don't like him. And we know about how damaging the Overwatch comparison was, but other than that, I don't know what exactly made people so upset about its existence. I suppose that was enough, especially because although Lawbreakers was decent, it wasn't great, meaning those external factors never ended up being overshadowed or forgotten. Within just a few weeks of release, it was becoming hard to find full matches. One of the main reasons I dropped the game, despite thinking it was pretty fun. This would be a devastating problem, as even those who did love Lawbreakers were slowly forced to look elsewhere simply because they could not get a lobby going. Boss Key took all of the usual next steps, with patches, content updates, adjustments based on player feedback, but none of it really seemed to matter. In October of 2017, Lawbreakers would get its first and only major content update, adding new maps, cosmetics, and a ranked mode. But once again, players weren't moved. Around the same time as this update, with player counts struggling to stay above 1,000 concurrent players on Steam at any given time, Boss Key tried another tactic, holding several free weekends where players could try the game at no cost. And yet, player counts continued plummeting. Even during these free-to-play periods, Boss Key literally could not give away Lawbreakers. That's how overwhelmingly rejected this game was by the gaming world. After those free-to-play weekends failed to move the needle in any meaningful way, it was pretty clear Lawbreakers could not be saved. The developers knew it, with no updates to be found throughout the early months of 2018, as the team basically went completely dark. Players knew it, as peak concurrent player counts on Steam were now falling below the triple digits. And so no one was all too surprised when Boss Key released a statement in April 2018 announcing they would be moving away from the project. As they explained in their statement, Lawbreakers failed to find enough of an audience to sustain it, and while many had been asking for a fully free-to-play pivot, the team did not feel they had the resources necessary for such a change. And while I hate to say it, that was the right call. We already saw from those free-to-play weekends that the issues of Lawbreakers went far deeper than the price tag. The public perception was already too far gone. Going free-to-play would have just been delaying the inevitable. Boss Key claimed they would continue to support Lawbreakers in its current state, likely meaning simple server maintenance and upkeep, while they began to focus on something new. Those plans, however, would quickly change. Boss Key released another game titled Radical Heights in April 2018, which could probably be given a whole video of its own, as it also failed to garner a long-term audience. 2 failures in a row for a small studio was all they could take, as it was announced Boss Key would be shutting down in May 2018. This meant that previously promised Lawbreakers support would be impossible, and the game would have to be shut down as well. On June 11th, 2018, Lawbreakers finally went free to play, something fans had been hoping would happen for quite some time. But this wasn't the last-ditch attempt to save the game the community was expecting. Rather, it was Boss Key waving the white flag, halting new purchases of a game which was set to become unplayable in the near future. And thus, on September 14th, 2018, just barely 1 year after its official launch, Lawbreakers was taken offline. It ended a bizarre saga that almost feels like it didn't even happen. As someone who was there at the time, everything crashed and burned so quickly that it felt unreal, like some lost relic that I played at one point before it disappeared into the ether. I will stand by the fact that I had some fun with Lawbreakers and feel like they did some good things with it, but it's also pretty clear that this was one of the most unmarketable video games of all time. When combined with the meteoric success of a close competitor, the failure of Lawbreakers was probably the only possible outcome. In the years since, Lawbreakers has become a completely forgotten entity by most, but as is the case with any game, it is not without its believers. There are still those out there who swear by it, certain that it was a victim of its time, not a truly bad game. In 2023, those fans were given a sign of life, with Bleszinski tweeting that he had been in touch with his lawyers and that fans of Lawbreakers could expect some news soon. Nothing seemed to come of this though, with publisher Nexon still owning the rights to the IP, and with Cliffy B largely moving away from game development in the years since this statement. However, in 2024, members of the community built fan servers titled RELB Project, an undertaking that Cliff himself tweeted support of. As far as I can tell, these fan servers are still up and running, although I'm unsure of its quality or frequency of players. The fact that something like RELB Project exists at all, though, is proof of what I mentioned at the start of this video. I don't think Lawbreakers was some horrific product that had nothing to like. It was just an alright game released at the worst possible moment, with a ton of external factors weighing it down. If it had come out 10 years earlier, it probably would have been another one of Cliff's big successes. Unfortunately though, it was not released 10 years earlier, and came when it did, pushing what was once one of gaming's most promising creators out of the industry, and leaving Lawbreakers as one of the most notorious failures in gaming history.